Morning, good afternoon, good evening. It was the Scottish philosopher and economist Adam Smith who famously said, we should not depend on the benevolence of the butcher or the brewer or the baker for our dinner, but rather on considering their interest. And that has been the foundation of economy, of sound economic policies. We must address ourselves not to the humanity or the butcher or the baker, but their self-love. Never talk to them of our own necessity, but their advantage. The economy thrives on profit. Give the butcher, the brewer, the incentive that they will make profit, and they will go ahead and make sure that you have got meat, you've got beer, you've got bread, etc., etc. It therefore becomes another matter when we are being forced to rely on the benevolence of a dictator. Here is a case in question. And in Zimbabwe politics, this is the norm now.
Zvino minista wangu awokuna uiskani damu rangu kaderekani zvinyara dzekukwaudza ndokubvanana murungu ari pano godax yawakuno wewe kuno kode fambisa so mavizondodalo yakumisindebeli namubiza ati uya nhapa ndoda wauye kichini achimhanya ndiona mukombe ipurazi kwangu ndikati ndakwashimumanzu kune dhamu ranonzwa kuti rakatsemuka ndanoritarira kana wauya undibudze kuti rogadzirika here mufana uyu akauya uno akatarira akadzoka purazi kwangu zvanzi ndari kati yes anzi ndokwanisa kuti ndirigadzira ndikati ndanogadzira ndokubhadhara ndii akagadzira indodana mwedzi yamboni mumunye wetu sala pasi ndo kuruma ndoto
What is interesting about that story is Mnangagwa is relating that there was a dam in Chirumanzu which was damaged. He called this individual and asked him whether he could repair it. He went down there, examined it, and came back and reported that he could repair it. Mnangagwa then told him, go and repair it, and I'll pay you. This has been the politics of Zimbabwe the last 40 years. where we, the people, have been made to rely on the generosity of the dictator, of the regime. The regime has undermined the individual spirit to do something for themselves and created this tragic situation where people have got to rely on the regime. And so it brings me back to what we were talking about earlier on, the quotation of Adam Smith, where Adam Smith was advising that we should be addressing ourselves not to the humanity of the butcher or the brewer or the baker, but to their self-love, to their profit. We should not rely on the benevolence of the butcher. And yet here we are. We are now having to rely on the benevolence of a dictator, of a tyrannical regime. What is the advantage? One might ask. Of course, in the case of ZANU-PF in Mnangagwa, is to retain power at all costs. That is the tragedy of Zimbabwe. We have been forced to rely on the benevolence of a dictator, where one might ask, is he getting the money to do all these things? Of course, he's getting it all from the looting of our own resources. So we're having a situation here where he is being generous, repairing the dam, using the money that he has looted from us, giving with one hand and taking even more with the other. And what makes this even more unacceptable is that this is the regime that rigged the elections. In other words, it's denying the people the right to a meaningful vote for the sake of the regime staying in power, the dictator staying in power, so we could be dependent on his benevolence. Welcome, Ben. Good evening.
Good evening to you, and good evening to our viewers. It's an interesting little video clip that you showed, but then I think we've talked about this, and I believe it comes down to ownership. Zimbabweans they really do not own. If you look at the Chirumans area, those are reserves. There is no sense of ownership because most of those people are on leases and given places using the chiefs and everything. They don't have title deeds to those places. If they had those title deeds, they would have ownership, and with sense of ownership comes development. I think we've talked about this. The reason why you find the reserves are not growing is because there is no ownership. You are leasing. You can't build something that is expensive, that is long term, when you don't have ownership of that. So for you then to expect that they would go and fix a dam for themselves, if they had ownership, I sincerely believe they would contribute. It may take them long, but they would contribute towards fixing their own dam. I've seen it when people have, Zimbabwe is developing in terms of residential areas. I've seen where people have ownership of those, houses or lands, right? They have, little piggy banks that they put, or trust funds that they put towards developing their area. I mean, they build their own roads. They pull their own electricity. They pull their own water. It's because they have ownership. So without that ownership, it's very difficult for you to now sacrifice towards a long-term thing like dams that tomorrow you may not be able to use. Yet you have put that infrastructure there for yourself. I mean, we have witnessed places where there's no ownership. You get chased like flies. Operations. Who put you there? They will ask you the question, and yet they forget they're the ones that actually give them that that go ahead there. I mean, we have seen people producing cancel letters that they've been paying rates, but because they didn't have title deeds, they didn't have ownership. So long-term plans for people that don't have that ownership, the title deeds, is is non-existent. So we can blame the people, yes, but to some extent, this is what the regime has created. They want to show that they are the ones that are doing it. They are the ones that are owning it at the end of the day.
Well, to just follow up on what you are saying there, I'll just play a short clip of Margaret Longo speaking of the same issue as well.
They have wrong priorities, especially the current government. How can you go and build an airport which services a few people, and the majority are the elite and the so-called investors? Look at the rural. I made you come to interview me because I wanted you to have the experience of the roads that we are using. If we go today to our hospital there, you feel pity with that's a hospital in a rural area. If we go to our clinic, you feel pity. We have no piped water here. Do you know the reason why the rural people vote for ZANU-PF? One, they're intimidated. Two, the policy is that the rural people should remain poor and subservient to the government. They should remain poor, because if they remain poor, they continue singing the song for their master. This is why these people have been impoverished. It's for a reason. Because at the moment, if you economic empower these people, they'll go out of hand. ZANU-PF will never have control over them.
That is very true. This is the problem we keep having here. And in this particular case, of course, it comes back to what I was talking about earlier on, where we now have to depend on the benevolence of the dictator. And we know that it is not out of generosity. It is out of enslaving us that he's doing all these things. Because he's taking with one hand and giving with another. And making a big song and dance about his generosity, when in reality, he's taking a lot more. I don't have to remind the listener out there of the Gold Mafia documentary that Al Jazeera produced last year. It spoke volumes of the level of corruption and looting that is taking place in Zimbabwe. Up to 80% of Zimbabwe's 2 billion per year gold mining is smuggled out of the country. And many of the smugglers had connections with the ruling elite, with Mnangagwa himself. Some of them refer to him as number one. So when they give him a cut of the share of the looting, some of that money is what he's using to pay somebody who repairs the dam. And we think he's being very generous. A lot of the money is used to rig elections. And hence the reason why we are stuck with the regime. As long as the regime is able to rig the elections, I don't think we'll ever see any meaningful change.
I've always asked, even on Facebook, in some some posts that people will be bragging to say, ED has done this, ED is doing this, and I always ask, at what cost is this development coming? Because I mean, you look at the amounts that are being talked about. Some of them are very, very ridiculous. And when you look at the actual infrastructure, let's say it's a bridge that has been put there, it doesn't match the figure that has been put across. And why would they be doing it? It's not out of love or out of let's develop our country. I mean, let's face it. Right now, they have planted. I think they've planted quite a huge sum just trying to fix up for this summit. Was it very necessary? I don't think so. Why? Because I know for sure that the heads of state have always been coming to Zimbabwe, paying courtesy calls, and coming for diplomatic missions, and they have seen what Zimbabwe is all about. Everybody knows Zimbabwe's got potholes, you know. So now for us to be starting to do all these things and try and cover up to say, people should not see what the real thing is or what the real deal is. People do know what the real deal is. And this is the unfortunate part, especially when you have a dictatorship. They are very, very much out of touch with reality. They only see what they, what they want to see. They're very, narcissistic and very, very big egos. This is why we find out that they will make song and dance out of building a dam. A dam that is supposed, not even one is supposed to be there. They should be having 2 or 3 dams because it's a big place. Chirumandu is a very, very big place, and from there people should have been. It all comes down to ownership, I suppose. Once people have ownership, you have a sense of entitlement, and you will go the extra mile to make your place beautiful. But without that, it's very, very difficult to now sacrifice something that you're not even sure of tomorrow. So I believe this is the place, like Margaret Ongo said, this is the place that they have put people such that they do not have power over them and they continue holding the power over the people. So nothing really moves together. And then you fail to find out where he says to say, "Nyika inovakwa nevene vayo." Who's vene? Who owns? 2 days ago, you were saying every land belongs to the president. So why then would I go all the way and do, all this when at the end of the day, it is not mine? You see? So this is where the problem is. And with that, development is told until you decide you want to move, going this way or going that way. There is no sense of, purpose for all of us to say we are all self-driven towards this mission because you haven't given us that opportunity to be part of it, to truly own it. I believe if people really own something, they are driven, they are motivated to say, you know what, we want to do A, B, C by this certain period, maybe 5, maybe 10 years. We want to, dams, talking of dams, that's irrigation mainly or fishery or whatever. If you have that sense of, ownership, you will say in 10 years we want to develop this here place to be, a harbor for market gardening using this dam. People will contribute to their dam slowly by slowly, they will get there. But if they don't have that sense of ownership, they are not driven, they're not motivated. There is nothing that motivates you to go the extra mile. So at the end of the day, I think the regime feels very, I think they pat themselves on the back when, they build a dam. They sang a big song and dance out of it. That's just how a narcissist person is wired.
Totally agree. I think in this particular case, we really have got to go back to Adam Smith. We should not deceive ourselves into believing that ZANU-PF is acting in our interest. It is not. ZANU-PF and Mnangagwa, everything they're doing out of their own selfish interest. We should not depend on the benevolence of a dictator. So let's go back to what kind of government do we want. I think we want a government in which all the citizens have a meaningful say in the governance of the country. In other words, elections should be free, fair, and credible. Zimbabwe is yet to hold free, fair, and credible elections. I think the most important right that the ordinary people, the 60% or so of our people in the rural areas, who live in the rural areas, would want is the right to own the land. That would be more meaningful to them than the right to a meaningful vote. Indeed, I've said on this platform, and I'll say it again, you give them the right to own the land, and claiming the right to a meaningful vote will make a lot of sense to them. I think we should be looking at, before 2028, pushing for title deeds to the rural areas, democratic reforms to ensure that elections are free, fair, and credible before 2028. Yes, I'll be the first one to admit I don't see that happening, given that ZANU-PF is not going to reform itself out of office. Yes, I'll also be the first one to admit that Nelson Chamisa and his MDC CCC friends will participate in the flawed elections, just as they've participated in flawed elections in the past, to give the regime legitimacy out of greed. The best way out for us is therefore that we should fight to educate the ordinary Chamisa Chete Chete brigade so that they do not vote and perpetuate the dictatorship. It is unbelievable that we have got so many millions of people who are so ignorant and naive. They don't see the sheer futility of participating in a flawed elections to give ZANU-PF legitimacy. And yet this is exactly what they've been doing. They've been easily conned by the likes of Chamisa to do so on the basis of a lie an idiotic lie for that matter, such as I've plugged all the vote-rigging loopholes. Still, that is the challenge. And the most important message, I will repeat, for this broadcast was or is that we should not rely on the benevolence of a dictator. Thank you very much, Ben. I don't know whether you want to give your closing remarks there.
Sorry, I just lost connection there. So, in conclusion, I would want to say, I think we love the idea of democracy, but we do not want to find the prerequisites or to do the prerequisites for us to achieve this. I mean, like you were saying, for us to get a government that is by the people, for the people, it's it's our ability as citizens to think for ourselves, to look into history, to find a way forward. I mean, you know, I would have guessed by now that we would have realized the futility of us continuously participating in rigged elections. The evidence is there way before we even go into the election itself. You look at how ZEC conducts, the registration process, the delimitation exercises, verification of what the voters roll. This is all done before the election. And we are already complaining before we go into the election that this has been manipulated. You would have thought, it would have deterred us to say, you know what, this, whatever we are doing is futile. There ain't nothing going to come out of this. But though, for some reason, we still go ahead with it, knowing fully well this thing is already rigged and done before we even go. And then 2 days later, we are now crying because it's not realization. If we say realization, is you did not know. You knew before you went into it that already the ground is not even. You are already, you're already lost before you even started the battle. This is just an academic process to a foregone conclusion. But for some reason, people believe this year. I find that is the most annoying thing. But you still do. And after that day, you cry foul. Who do you want to listen to your nonsense at the end of the day? Right? Nobody will listen. Because we ourselves, you knew. They will tell you the same, whether it be Sadak, whether it be who. They will tell you you knew. Sometimes we've even given you recommendations, from previous, and you still have not done anything about those. So at the end of the day, people will decide to say, probably these guys belong wallowing in the mud because they can't seem to get themselves out of it. And as Dr. Mumba said, it remains our own preserve to get us out of this mess. Nobody, you can blame Sadak. Sadak is not meant to get us out of this mess. Zimbabweans will get Zimbabwe out of this mess. Period. We can go blaming anybody else. Nobody cares. They're by their own and doing their own. We are in this and we need to fix it. And the only way we can fix is by fixing us ourselves, us Zimbabweans, individually, then we go collectively. Then we start moving forward. What do we need to do? We've identified the problem. Problem is ZANU-PF is Zimbabwe is under dictatorship. The opposition is in a mess. Now that we've finished this, let us now look for a solution. 24 years identifying a problem is just too much. And doing the same thing is just too much. We are now going into 28 years. That is a lifetime now. That is a lifetime. Surely you would have thought we would be getting somewhere by now. I hope it's not too late. We can fix this. I'm very optimistic. We can fix this if we pull together, if we think together collectively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. So I'll underline the message again. We have been put in a position where we now are depending on the benevolence of a dictator. We are at the mercy of a dictator. We are addressing ourselves to the dictator's humanity, which it doesn't have. We need to end the dictatorship, and the only sure way to end it is to restore the individual right to a meaningful say in the governance of the country. We want free, fair, and credible elections. ZANU-PF rigged last year's elections, just as the regime has rigged elections in the past. Let's make sure that they don't do it in 2028. Thank you very much, and have a good night.